Good evening, everybody. My name is Madelyn Hoffman. I'm one of the co-chairs for GPACS, the Green Party U.S. Peace Action Committee, and welcome to our webinar tonight called Never Again, Remembering the Atomic Bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so much to talk about. I'm going to just do a little bit of an introduction here and then turn it over to Hai Kavanis, another co-chair, and Timon Wallace and David Kraft, and I'll introduce them one at a time. But this day has meant a lot to many people all over the world for 81 years. It is hard to believe it's now 81 years, but that's what it is. And my exposure to all this began when I was the director for an organization called New Jersey Peace Action in New Jersey, of course. Um, and I was fortunate enough in that role to, from 2000 to 2018, to meet Hibakusha, to meet survivors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And that was their slogan, never again. And they would often organize large delegations to come to the U.S. to march in the streets of New York City and to advocate for abolition of nuclear weapons, not control of nuclear weapons, not, just total abolition, because they believed, and so did I, and so did peace organizations, that human beings and atomic weapons were on a collision course and could not coexist. And since that day, I was also uh, fortunate to go to Japan in 2015 for the 70th anniversary or commemoration of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I spent 5 or 6 days in Hiroshima and 3 or 4 days in Nagasaki. And I was remembering earlier today being in Hiroshima on August 6th, 2015, walking from the hotel to the Peace Park in Hiroshima. And it was blistering hot already at 7 o'clock in the morning. Um, and I was thinking about the people who in 2015, not 2015, excuse me, 1945, um, were on their way to work or on their way to school or on their way to go shopping. And it was a beautiful day, sunny day, hot day, and they had no idea what was going to happen at 8:15 that morning. And well, ever since that day, there have been commemorations. When I was there in 2015, we went to the Peace Museum. I walked over a bridge where all that you could see were the shadows of people who had just evaporated and disappeared with the bombing. There were small memorials all along the river. I walked along the river, marble or rock, and little memorials. And there were plastic bottles on some of these memorials, and I thought, gee, the Japanese are so fastidious, and the Japanese. So why are all these empty plastic bottles there on the tombs? And I found out much later on that they were there because so many people that day, August 6th, They thought they could cool off by jumping into the river, and they thought they could address their thirst with water from the river, and everything was so hot it only made things worse. So those memorials with the empty bottles of water were there symbolically to represent the number of people who died of thirst and died of dehydration. And the Hibakusha, and have the exhibits from Hibakusha, survivors, and the exhibits in the museums, the local museums, so many pictures of people with skin peeling off. The images, I always thought, and I still do, that those images from Hibakusha should be from that day, stories from that day, every legislator should have to watch and should have to see the results of what happened when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and also then a few days later, August 9th, on Nagasaki. Um, we are now 85 seconds to midnight, according to the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, the closest we've ever been to the dropping of another atomic bomb, which the world cannot sustain, could not survive. And we have so many hot spots. Um, you know, we used to, when I was first working for New Jersey Peace Action, we thought about Afghanistan, Syria, where Russia and the US might confront each other, and then, would be a risk of a nuclear bomb. But today, the number of hotspots is much greater than that. And every day, every day we hear something about a tactical nuke, a nuclear option. Oh, Israel says if we go down, we're taking everybody with us. We hear these threats over and over and over again. And I'm just glad every morning when I wake up, that everything is still in place. So I don't want to speak too much longer at this point. I will introduce Hai Kavanis, who will put this into even more of context than I did, and go deeper. And I will then introduce David Kraft and Tim and Wallace, but not in that order. Tim and Wallace, and then David Kraft, and then David Kraft. Hi, is the co-chair of GPACs and someone who has done a lot of research into nuclear weapons, the history of nuclear weapons, and and the, the current risks from nuclear weapons. So, Haig, I turn it over to you for 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Madeline. I'm going to go through some slides and try not to take up too much time. So I'm going to be sharing my screen to put up my PowerPoint. Okay, yeah, make this a bit bigger. I'd like to start by providing some perspective on the atomic bombing. It was a terrible landmark event in history, but it's important to understand that it was the culmination of a really savage and destructive aerial bombing campaign that started 6 months earlier with a systematic series of firebombing raids conducted by the U.S. Air Force. They had determined that high-level strategic bombing was ineffective in doing as much destruction as they wished, and then did some analysis and determined that low-level incendiary bombing would be more effective, so to speak. And as a result, just about every city in Japan was struck with these terrible incendiary weapons. And the scale of it adds up actually to more death and destruction than the two atomic bombings. And people don't really register this earlier hellish episode in the end of the Pacific War. If you look at this chart, you'll see that the worst attack of all happened to Tokyo a couple of months earlier, with more almost roughly as many deaths as the combined total of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The U.S. Air Force succeeded in generating a firestorm that uh, uh, took a terrible toll. And um, what these deaths don't indicate, of course, is all the injured, but another dimension is the raw material destruction. If you look at this chart, you'll see that vast areas of urban structures were just wiped out. And for comparison, these are cities in the last column that had roughly the same size as the Japanese cities that were struck. So you could just imagine this scale of devastation on these major American cities to get a glimpse of what had happened in those terrible 6 months, and then culminating with the Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks. Um, and I'm not showing you this just to demonstrate the terrible horror of the war against Japan, because this set a precedent for mass destruction. The American public became habituated to this systematic campaign against of indiscriminate attacks on urban centers. We're talking about kindergartens and hospitals and old age homes and the slaughter of the innocent, essentially. And this is where it began. This is where Americans came to accept that total war meant indiscriminate killing. And to this day, there is a tacit acceptance that in the nuclear war plans of the United States, there are so-called counter value strikes, which means indiscriminate destruction of major urban areas. And I believe the reason no one in Congress or in the public insists on seeing what's in the nuclear football, that briefcase the president's aides carry around with him, is that we don't want to accept that responsibility. We don't want to know that we have tacitly accepted the destruction of civilians on an apocalyptic scale. So it started in 1945. It was more than just the Hiroshima attacks. It was a commitment by the United States to normalize this kind of terrible warfare. A little bit of post-World War II history. The numbers involved in the great nuclear arms race are astounding when we look back at them. Both sides, the US and Russia, accumulated in a mad rush to secure supremacy tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, peaking around 30,000 in the US arsenal, and then the Russians trying even harder to catch up, getting up to 40,000 nuclear warheads. And fortunately, this fever broke with the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was a crazed period that is hard to believe, actually, when we look back at the numbers. So what we had after the after the 62 crisis was an awakening of sanity and a series of arms control agreements that gradually worked down the number of warheads. I won't go into all the details, but the chart pretty much tells the story. You see just about an order of magnitude decrease in the nuclear weapons stockpiles. If only it had stayed that way. But all these important agreements have been abrogated. I think the only one left intact is uh, the space agreement restricting putting nuclear weapons in orbit, and de facto START 2. It has lapsed both for the US and Russia, but neither side is making any noises about direct violation. This is just a recap of some of these major treaties, and it has to be stated plainly, it was the US that did the abrogating. Under multiple administrations, we just tore up all these crucially important treaties. And as a result, we're in a much more dangerous situation today. We've gone ahead with new nuclear weapons programs, some of them quite destabilizing. In particular, the introduction of low-yield nuclear warheads. Anything that reduces the threshold of the use of nuclear weapons is extremely dangerous. The temptation to introduce a low-yield weapon on the assumption that no further escalation will ensue is a very dangerous assumption. But as we sit here today, there are now low-yield warheads deployed on U.S. missile submarines, just waiting for some risk taker in Washington to commit to their use. As Madelyn indicated, it's now 85 seconds to midnight. And to put that in context, this chart, I wish I had inverted the scale because high is good and low is bad. The previous maximum danger point was, according to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, 53 with the first H-bomb test, which was rightly viewed as extremely threatening because the H-bomb was 100 times more devastating than the fission bomb. And then you see the easing of the clock, pushing back the clock. And the safest it's been in its history was at the end of the Cold War, because everyone thought, oh my, no more confrontation across the Iron Curtain. Now we can all breathe easy. Now we can cash the peace dividend. Now we can retire all these weapons. But no, since the turn of the millennium, we're going back to a situation just as dangerous as we faced around the time of the early Cold War. So let me finish up by describing the current dangers of escalation. I'm going to show you three scenarios that everyone agrees each one could turn into a catastrophic nuclear war. The Mideast, obviously, is a powder keg, and Israel is nuclear armed, and its ally, the US, is nuclear armed. And Iran is potentially a nuclear power. Some people believe that they have a breakout capability that within a week or two they could have a deliverable device. Other people assert that they may have arrangements with Pakistan to supply such a device. Again, we're into a casino of terrible risk here. So it's easy to envision a situation where Israel feels cornered. Let's say Iran manages to inflict tremendous damage on Israel, and you might see nuclear use there. And where that ends up, nobody knows. You know, a lot of people talk about experts in nuclear strategy, but there are no experts in something that's never occurred. We're into the unknown the minute the first nuclear weapon is used in modern times. So here's another scenario, Taiwan. It's almost like the Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse. Let's say the US provides missiles to Taiwan, and then tensions increase, and then the US says, well, we're going to have nuclear armed missiles, so Taiwan can deter China and prevent China from ever contemplating an invasion, just as Russian nuclear missiles were to deter the US from an invasion of Cuba. And we saw how well that worked out. And if China declares a blockade Taiwan and demands the missiles be removed, well, what happens if the US tries to break the blockade and ships get sunk and shots are fired? Where will that go? What if somehow Taiwan launches a nuclear weapon against China? Where is that going to end up? And then we have the largest war in Europe since 1945 in Ukraine. And most observers concluded that there was no way Ukraine was going to win that war, and it looks like it's moving in that direction. But let's say Ukraine makes a final desperate appeal and NATO intervenes, begins attacking Russian forces, begins striking on a large scale into Russia. Russia decides it has to resort to its nuclear doctrine, which states that if there's a danger to the state, nuclear weapons use is justified. And US doctrine is increasingly resembling that as well. So Russia retaliates with tactical nuclear weapons. Where does that go? All of these scenarios are open the door to a global nuclear conflict. So what should be done? It's obvious that some major steps have to be taken. The anti-nuclear war movement has to get its act together, and there has to be unified action across peace groups. There should be a major effort to commit the USA to no first use, and we should be halting destabilizing weapons development, especially space-based weapon systems, which are extremely threatening and also vulnerable to destruction. There should be a return to compliance with existing treaties and new treaties as well. There should be a reduction of arsenals to a minimal size, and then finally, progress toward abolition. So with that, I would like to return to Madelyn, who will introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Haig. Um, I wanted to just interject a couple really quick things in terms of the Japanese and the US, because I met a woman just before, a Japanese woman, just before I went to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 2015, and she explained that firebombing very, in great detail, and how under one particular bridge near where she lived, there were bodies and more bodies and more bodies. And what she said to me stayed with me for all these years. She said, no one has ever apologized to the Japanese for any of it. And we remember, the controversy with Obama when he did go and he wouldn't apologize. I think the U.S. needs to take a good look at itself in terms of in terms of what you opened up by describing Haig. And then the second really quick thing I wanted to add was Einstein's warning, because I remember uh, when I taught political science and we looked at the nuclear age, he said, as difficult as it was to develop the nuclear bomb, he said it's going to be even harder to manage the politics of it afterwards. And unfortunately, his words turned out to be correct because right now, with the pressure on Iran, the U.S. has been provocative, is provoking new threats and new possible uses of nuclear weapons. So I just wanted to add those two things. And like talking about tactical nukes, like it's pancakes for breakfast, instead of talking about the genuine dangers from tactical nukes. Okay, so our next speaker will be Timon Milne Wallace. He is the Executive Director of Nuclear Ban US. He holds a PhD in Peace Studies from Bradford University. He has served as Executive Director of Nonviolent Peace Force, and he has directed peace-building projects in Colombia, Guatemala, Mexico, Northern Ireland, Kosovo, Georgia, Myanmar, Chechnya, Croatia, Sri Lanka, Philippines, and South Sudan. He certainly has an impressive international record. And I will add that he is a member of ICANN, the International Coalition for the Abolition of Nuclear Weapons, and ICANN received the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. So he's very distinguished, very experienced, and very well known. Okay, it's all yours, Timon.
Okay, thank you. Well, thanks for having me, and thanks to Haig and Madeline for setting the scene. What I'm hoping to do is to pick up where Haig left off. The very last slide was about global progress towards abolition of nuclear weapons, and that's what I want to talk about. And I've got some slides to share, so I'll put those up. Sorry, that's just us. I want to just firstly reiterate the horrific evil that nuclear weapons represent, and the hugely dangerous situation that we're in right now, which both of the previous speakers have really highlighted. But I want to also talk about the positive side of that, which is that there is a lot happening on the movement towards abolition, and not only around the world, but also in the US. So I want to talk a bit about that, which is the subject of my book, Nuclear Abolition, a Scenario, and it's just one scenario, but it's all based around this treaty, which is what we got the Nobel Peace Prize for in 2017. I hope you all have heard of it by now, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It doesn't just prohibit nuclear weapons, it prohibits everything to do with nuclear weapons, and that's the crucial piece that is enabling us to be moving towards actual abolition, which I'll try to convince you about. So here is a map of countries that have some relation so far to this treaty. As you can see, the United States does not, and neither does Russia or China. In fact, none of the nuclear armed countries are in this treaty as yet, but a huge number are. This map is actually a little bit out of date, but the blue countries have signed and ratified the treaty by now, and the green ones have signed it, are in the process of ratifying it. The yellow ones have voted for this treaty every year in the UN, but they voted for resolutions calling on every country to sign and ratify the treaty, but they haven't yet done so themselves, so we're still pushing on that. And then the orange countries are the really interesting ones, because these are where governments are under enormous pressures to sign the treaty right now. And you'll see in Europe, for instance, quite a few countries, Spain and Germany, which both have coalition governments, have parties in the government coalition that have called for those countries to sign the treaty. And Australia, interestingly enough, well, here's some opinion polls. I'll come back to that. Here's This is the Prime Minister of Australia, who is personally committed to getting his country on board with the treaty. So, I mean, they haven't yet, but it's moving in that direction. Now, why do I want to go back to the... Okay, well, never mind. So we've got countries that are signing, ratifying under enormous pressure with opinion polls very, very strongly in favor of joining the treaty in Europe especially. And then we have countries that are taking further steps. So this is a law in Ireland which prohibits everything to do with nuclear weapons. And if anyone is prosecuted under this law, they're liable to a fine or imprisonment for life. And this isn't just to do with, walking around with a nuclear weapon. This is to do with development, research, assistance with these activities, maintenance of weapons. And, this is where the pressure on the companies that actually make nuclear weapons is building in other parts of the world. And here is a recent Hall of Fame from the Don't Bank on the Bomb, which is an international campaign connected to ICANN for divestment from nuclear weapons. And some of the largest pension funds in the world have already divested from nuclear weapons. More and more are joining this effort, and more than $4 trillion have been divested from nuclear weapons, which compared with fossil fuels, for example, I mean, fossil fuels has got more than $40 trillion of divestment, but it's a lot of money that's being taken out of the industry for their investing, and it's putting pressure on these companies. And just to give you an example, I've got a couple maps here of where these companies operate, because they make nuclear weapons for the US primarily, but they're operating all over the world, and including in many of these 101 countries that have so far joined this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So the pressure is on these companies in these other countries, and that's a key thing which we've never had before. It's a legal pressure, but it's also divestment, it's public perceptions and stigmatizing of these companies for having anything to do with these evil weapons. So this is Airbus, which is a French company. This is another French company. There's Bechtel, which is a US company. I mean, they're operating all over the world, and the more that these other countries are putting pressure on them, the more they're feeling the world opinion moving away from nuclear weapons. And it's not happening overnight, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but this is a momentum that is building globally, and it's very, very important that we find ways to support that. And so here in the United States, there's a lot going on as well. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with Mayors for Peace. It's a very simple statement that any city can do, even if you don't have a mayor, you can, your select board or whatever can sign this. And there's tens of thousands of cities across the world that have joined this. But in the United States, there's, I think, 200 so far, and more are joining. This was a recent one, I think, I can't remember where that particular picture is, but this is in Milwaukee. Again, resolutions being passed by cities to say we don't want to have nuclear weapons. We want to abolish them. Getting cities to pass resolutions, getting faith communities, churches, and so on. Green Party, for example. I don't know if you've signed up to any of these resolutions, but these are symbolic, but they're important statements of where people stand on these horrible weapons. Nuclear-free zones. Again, this was going very big in the 1980s and 90s, but it's coming back, and some of the new nuclear-free zones, for instance, in Spokane, Washington, recently became a nuclear-free zone, and this is New York City, which the city council voted to divest from nuclear weapons. As I said, some of the largest pension funds in the world have done this. New York City hasn't actually divested yet, but they voted to do it. Philadelphia just recently voted the same resolution to divest its pension funds from nuclear weapons. So there's momentum building. This is behind me here, the Massachusetts State House a bill that there's been several bills to get states to take a stand, but not just cities. It's a lot more difficult, obviously, but there is progress. There's several states now that have passed the Back from the Brink resolution, and we've been working on divestment in Massachusetts. It's not passed this year, but we're going to keep trying. So there is momentum moving. These are the companies that are in the way. And so in terms of the next steps, what can we all do? What can you do? What can the Green Party do? What can activists do? We've got to go after these companies. We have this global momentum around the world, and we can do a lot here to complement and add to that by putting pressure on these companies. And with lots of different ways of doing that. I mentioned, resolutions and so on and divestment, but there's also cities, my own city, Northampton, Massachusetts, we got to pass an ordinance saying that they will not do business with any of these companies. And other cities are doing that. We've got businesses that have signed a pledge saying that they will not do business with any of these companies. Boycotts. Many of these companies are military primarily, but some like Honeywell. I mean, Honeywell makes thermostats. You probably have a Honeywell thermostat in your house, but they also make a lot of other products. And if we could get more people boycotting these and stigmatizing the companies with social media messages and so on, and direct action outside their offices. I mean, we had a campaign about the Boeing headquarters in just outside Washington, D.C., and they've decided to move their headquarters. I'm sure it wasn't because of us directly, but I mean, these companies don't like the bad publicity. They don't like the public going against them, and this is one of the tools that we have to actually make a difference. And so I'm going to leave it there and let you think about all the ways that you can help get rid of nuclear weapons. There's some of the nuclear-free zones in the 80s, and that So in the 80s, we did this. I mean, you saw the slide from Haig of after the Cold War and the numbers started going down. These are B-52 bombers, nuclear weapon bombers, that were chopped up in pieces so that the Russians could see from satellites that they were destroyed. And they did the same thing on that side. And I'm going to end with this slide outside the UN building in New York. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but it's a statue. And if you look carefully, you can see it's actually made of pieces of nuclear weapons from both the US and the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. When they were destroying these weapons and dismantling them, they built a statue, and it's outside the UN, and it's a symbol of what's possible. We can do this. So we gotta keep at it until we can do it. And if you're interested in more, I've got a book called Nuclear Abolition: A Scenario, which goes into all these steps in great detail. And that's my 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tim. And I'm just going to ask you to, because I saw warheads to windmills on one of the banners. Is that an organization that
We
people
have
should
a
join, and how to do that?
Yeah, we have a coalition of about 70 organizations, including I think at least two Green Party branches, the Green Party of Florida and the Green Rainbow Party of Massachusetts are part of our national coalition. And we're working on supporting the treaty that I was talking about to abolish nuclear weapons, but also the treaty that's being developed right now to phase out fossil fuels, because the Warheads to Windmills campaign is about using all of the money and the resources and the scientific and engineering expertise that's being wasted on nuclear weapons. We need that to solve the climate crisis. So that's our Warheads to Windmills campaign. And there's another book about that which you can also order.
Okay, that's great. And asking you a question reminded me that I didn't let the audience know that we're using the question and answer feature if you have a question, you can put it in the question and answer feature, and we will have questions and answers once we've heard from David Kraft. So thank you, Timon, and now I will introduce David Kraft. Um, David Kraft is founder and director of the Nuclear Energy Information Service, or NEIS, which you can see on his banner behind behind his person, um, based in Chicago. And so I don't know if it, oh, you said you had met some Greens from Florida in Chicago, no, at the annual national meeting a couple weeks ago. Um, for over 40 years, David Kraft has provided educational programs, conferences, and presentations about the nuclear industry and its effects. He created the series No Nukes, but that's spelled KNOW, No Nukes, in cooperation with CAN TV in Chicago, and co founded the Radiation Monitoring Project, designed for communities struggling with radioactive contamination. And David, to, if you can at some point also address what we talked about earlier, which is these states that are lifting 40 or 50-year bans on new nuclear power plants and connecting them to artificial intelligence data centers, and kind of explain that threat as well. I know you, I just want to remind you of that. I know you were going to address it anyway. So I turn it over to you, David Kraft.
Thank you, Madeline. I appreciate it. And good evening, everyone. I really appreciate your offering to have us on your panel tonight. And I want to give a shout out to Rita Maniatos, who did invite us to the national conference, and we did a tabling there and met some wonderful people. So thank you very much for that opportunity. Um, it's possible that tonight I'm going to offend a lot of people, which is not unusual in my case, but I'll explain why in a minute, and I think it'll become obvious. NEIS was formed in 1981. My experience with the nuclear issue goes back further than that. I came to it by accident. It's called 3 Mile Island. And we've been working on this issue on the nuclear power front ever since, because many other organizations, which were either larger, better resourced, whatever, were dealing with the nuclear weapons issue. That doesn't mean we haven't collaborated or we don't have a position. We are definitely opposed to the nuclear weapons industry completely. Um, and we also want to emphasize the other half of our work, which is to advocate for a renewable energy future to supplant nuclear power. So that is a backdrop. If I weren't here with you tonight, I would be down at the University of Chicago on the South Side at the Henry Moore Sculpture to Nuclear Power, which is the birthplace of the atomic age, on December 2nd, 1942, where the first chain reaction took place. There are activists from the Chicago area who have been doing this memorial for decades at that location on this very day in this evening to express their grief, their sadness that we are in such a horrible situation worldwide regarding the nuclear weapons issue. Now, here's where things are going to get a little contentious, because my program tonight doesn't always go over very well, even in the environmental community that we're members of. And it's to get across, oops, that didn't work. Let's try this again on share screen. Get across the idea that nuclear power and nuclear weapons are closely intertwined. And if we, oh, for some reason, my share screen is not working. It worked earlier. Let me try one more time. Okay, I think we've got it now. So from the beginning. Yes. Are we good? All right. This will be my topic tonight, is to fill you in on some background information as to why we are really not going to be making as much progress on the nuclear weapons front until we also confront the nuclear power front. So I've done this in different ways before, this idea of nuclear power and nuclear weapons being birds of the feather. I'll be showing a lot of wordy slides, but I want you to know that we have an information sheet on our website, which gives the sources for the information I'll be giving you tonight. And I also welcome questions and discussion when we get down to it after I speak. Oh, here we go again. There. So a colleague of mine with Physicians for Social Responsibility has been on this issue for quite a while. And I paraphrase what he says, but the position is pretty clear. That he sees that nuclear power is being used and has been used as literally a fig leaf for the nuclear weapons that we are fighting. When you take a look at the two industries together, side by side, they're essentially the same with one slight variation I'll get into. It's the same physics, same materials that get manufactured either for nuclear fuel or nuclear bombs, the same infrastructure of academia, laboratories, Department of Energy, other government facilities, sometimes personnel. If you lose your job in one sector, you cross the street and get a job in the other. Same radiation, alpha, beta, gamma, and neutrons in both of those industries. The radioactive wastes, somewhat different in certain aspects, but both generate radioactive waste, which is hazardous for the planet for tens of thousands of years. And unfortunately, every so often, the results of the two are very similar. Certainly not in the radiological context of Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but when you take a look at Chernobyl, you take a look at Fukushima, you see that nuclear power has its own ability to be devastating in different ways, but just as catastrophic. Now, I'm not old enough to remember this by a couple of years, but I was around when Dwight Eisenhower in 1953 proposed the Atoms for Peace program. And I can understand it. I'm not here to judge President Eisenhower. I think shortly after World War II, there may have been a very large and genuine movement to want to undo or atone for the grief, the destruction, the havoc that the bombs in Japan created. And maybe they even had an inkling of what a nuclear future would be if there were a nuclear war. So I'm sure there were some genuine feelings of guilt or a need to atone in some manner for the destructiveness of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That would be nuclear power. Unfortunately, things got corrupted very early on. And this is what I think most people don't understand. As far back as the early 1950s, the Atomic Energy Commission were conducting studies which pointed out that what was really desirable if we were to have a nuclear weapons program was to have what they call dual purpose reactors, which would not only provide electricity for a commercial sector, but would be able to be a source of plutonium for warheads for the nuclear weapons program. I think one of the most interesting ones for us was when we discovered the 1952 annual shareholders report for our local electric utility, Commonwealth Edison, which pointed out they were very interested in this idea of a dual purpose reactor. But as this slide indicates, it would only be good if they would have the opportunity to sell the plutonium back to the government so that they could make nuclear weapons. The studies continue, the attitudes continue, the Atomic Energy Commission continued to look into it. Got a little further along in 1954 when Congress amended the Atomic Energy Act, because up to that point, nuclear materials, nuclear technology was solely within the confines of the federal government. In 1954, though, Congress loosened the reins enough where they would start looking into these dual purpose reactors so that they could get a hold of the plutonium, which would then be sent over to Colorado to make the plutonium triggers for nuclear weapons. Fast forward to 1981, it summarizes pretty much everything I've shown you. I'll read the quote. There is no technical demarcation between the military and civilian reactor, and there never was one. What has persisted over the decades is just the misconception that such a linkage does not exist. This is Los Alamos, federal government saying it's a fiction. They're tied together. They always were. Later on, we take a look at the proliferation situation, which I think also emphasizes the point that the two are linked. You had India and Pakistan and Israel getting their bombs from so-called peaceful reactors, research reactors. And then such luminaries as Mohammed al-Baradei, the former director of the IAEA in 2008, pointing out that actually you don't even need a bomb per se, but if you had a nuclear power program, that kind of gets the word out that you could be threatening in some way. It's an insurance policy or a deterrence. And some of you may recall that not too long ago, one of the former prime ministers of Japan sort of gave a left-handed swipe to China saying, well, we do have a lot of plutonium stockpiled here, which we could easily manufacture into weapons. So the idea of nuclear power as being a leverage on other nations, tying it to the nuclear weapons program, is replete throughout our history. So it's not just no nukes kooks saying this. This is Ernie Moniz, former Secretary of Energy, just a few years back, pointing out that the US military and the nuclear power industry are linked in terms of national security. Many of you know this, many of you may not know this. The commercial power reactor in the TVA, Watts Bar, has been producing the tritium that is needed for warhead yield enhancement for H-bombs. And just in the Biden administration, they had applied to produce more tritium for that process. There have been numerous bills in the Congress over the last decade to sort of bail out the nuclear power industry by giving sweetheart deals with the Department of Defense to provide electricity generated by nuclear power for Department of Defense facilities. Now, if you think this is just an American phenomenon, you're wrong, because the president of France, the poster child for nuclear power worldwide, didn't shy away from it. He was very clear. One cannot exist without the other. Without civil nuclear power, there is no military nuclear power. And without military nuclear power, there is no civil nuclear power. Plain as day. What about today? The Trump administration's plans over the last two administrations, actually, are absolutely outrageous in terms of nuclear power. He's proposed in the last year quadrupling the number of reactors we have in the United States by 2050, while at the same time cutting the regulatory staff almost in half. So you have less regulation and 4 times as much nuclear power. Tens of billions of dollars are being allocated to commercial nuclear power programs of all kinds at this point. Just a few weeks ago, President Trump announced a plan suggesting that we might sell this plutonium to private companies so they could perhaps use it for some of these new reactors that they are proposed building. Just last week, you probably heard the news that the United States, wants to provide Saudi Arabia with our uranium enrichment capability. As if the sun didn't shine, in Saudi Arabia and they couldn't get their electrons some other way. And then finally, just today, I had to add this one recently, the Pentagon has got plans for a portable nuclear reactor that they want to be using in the field. So these are the linkages that are so obvious that say there's no distinction. It's just a matter of scale. Who wants nuclear power? It's pretty obvious. The Biden administration pushed it. Trump administration is following up on that. The conservative governments who are not particularly fond of renewables or who are backing fossil fuels like Poland. I don't have to run down the list of the authoritarian and anti-democratic governments that want it. And certainly the states that want nuclear weapons ambitions like Saudi Arabia, even South Korea and Japan. Nuclear power plants of any variety, the old variety we have operating, the ones they're planning for the future, the small ones, the big ones, the portable ones, they will not be able to be operated safely in a world where war is rampant. And I have to give props to Haig for his pointing out the fact of what are the hot zones that are real possible. Certainly Taiwan and China, certainly even India and Pakistan, not to mention the Middle East. Reactors are vulnerable in those areas. And the most recent example of that, I think, is when someone pushed a drone projectile through the sarcophagus at the Chernobyl nuclear plant, rendering a $3 billion engineering effort to contain the Chernobyl accident ineffective in a war zone. That shows you how vulnerable nuclear power will be in war zones. The big fantasy right now, though, is that the industry is wanting small reactors. They call them small modular nuclear reactors. And here is a illustration of the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana that wants to build what they call a micro nuke on their campus. They would put it underground, and they claim that that would make it safe and invulnerable for any problems that you could possibly have.
Excuse the interruption, David. You've got 2 minutes to finish
All
up
right,
your thoughts.
we'll move faster. This is what Mariupol looks like. Where would you put small modulars there underground? You might notice that some of the people here show you the relative scale of these craters. Gaza, same thing. Some of them want to go on trucks and truck them around the country to power sites, to remote areas. I mentioned the Department of Energy or the Department of Defense wants to take them in the battlefields. What could go wrong? This is what happens to well-armored tanks in Ukraine. They're torn to shreds. What would happen if those mobile reactors are on the road and someone lobs one of these missiles that are readily available on the black market into those canisters? 3 years ago, I was on a program opposite this man, Brigadier General Wendell Chris King, a retired 3-star general. His position was supposed to be in favor of nuclear, mine was supposed to be opposed to it. At the end of the hour, we were in probably 90% agreement. He did not know anything about these small nuclear reactor plans, and his 20 years of experience as a national security expert said, I don't know how we can protect the country if we have hundreds or thousands of these tiny reactors being sprinkled around the place. I can give you the URL if you want to hear the show in its entirety. So where does that leave us? Once again, the nuclear hucksters are out there saying, we got it this time. It's going to be low cost, no problems. Don't worry about it. Unfortunately, that's not the case. If we are really serious about ending nuclear weapons and nuclear threat, if we're serious about respecting the dead of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and if we really mean never again, we're going to have to change our attitudes about nuclear power as well as nuclear weapons. And it's been one of my big frustrations for the last 45 years that my colleagues, many of the colleagues in the nuclear weapons movement, don't want to even talk about that and take it on. And certainly, in a broader sense, even the environmental community is reluctant to take on the issue of nuclear power, even though the history, the documentation, and the real life experiences that are going on around the world today show how the two morph into one another. So that is what I have. I thank you for your patience. And now we can get to questions and answers.
Thank you so much, David. I have a quick question just to follow up on what you just said. You started to say earlier, I think, how many states were lifting moratorium on the construction of nuclear power plants. Do you have a concrete number for that? Or
Yes, a number and a little background wouldn't hurt.
okay.
In the 1980s and even in the early 1990s, it was obvious that the federal government was going to renege on its obligation, which is under the law, that they were supposed to take care of the high-level radioactive waste from nuclear power plants and put it in a permanent facility for disposal, not storage,
Hmm.
not temporary. That was their mandate, and they failed. A lot of states that had nuclear power plants, like Illinois, we are the largest of the states. We have 11 operating reactors. We have 14 total. 3 are closed. And we have almost 11,000 tons of high-level radioactive waste. Those states were starting to get concerned that they were going to be targeted as de facto high-level radioactive waste facilities for the nation. So they started passing at the state level moratoria on building new nuclear power plants. Now, a moratorium is a temporary thing. It's not a permanent ban. You'll hear that word misused. But the idea was that you could not build a nuclear power plant unless the federal government had an operating disposal facility. So it put political pressure back on Washington to get off its butt and do its legally mandated job. Illinois had a moratorium, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Oregon, Washington, many states did. Unfortunately, through the Biden administration and the Trump administration, a huge effort has been made to repeal these moratoria. And I regret to say that Illinois repealed its moratorium last year and completely, and Wisconsin also did. Minnesota is being threatened, and Oregon and Washington state are fighting back. So some states have moratoria still in place, others have had them repealed, and it's because the Department of Energy has largely operated as the promotional arm and public relations firm for the nuclear industry to lobby the hell out of state legislators and get rid of the moratoriums. Did that? I didn't have numbers, but I can get you a list of the states that are still have moratoriums and which ones have also repealed them.
Right. Please add New Jersey to the repeal.
Right.
But I'm sure there are others. Um, I we have a couple questions for Dr. Kraft, but I don't see anything at the moment for Tim and Wallace. Um, I accept perhaps this one because I think both of you could probably answer it. Um, s- the question is from Rita Maniotas from Wisconsin. So there can be no abolition of nuclear war without an abolition of nuclear power. It's not directed to anyone in particular. Um, so I open it up to both of you to answer, and I'd like to hear from Timon, and then come back to you, David,
Hi, you want to go first?
Uh,
Or Haig.
uh,
I'm sorry.
well, the problem is this dual use of highly enriched nuclear fuel. Um, this came to prominence a while back when breeder reactor designs were considered because it was introduced as a brilliant engineering advance, a reactor that could produce more fuel than it consumed. But the fuel it produced was highly fissionable and perfect weapons grade material. So now you have a nuke plant that's potentially a target for a terrorist seizure of fissionable material. And just think of Trump's obsession with preventing enriched uranium from reaching the hands of any regime he finds unfriendly. Imagine if you had hundreds of plants generating nuclear bomb material throughout the world, even throughout the United States. So it's a real headache. And in a sense, the danger, the weapons can't be uninvented. The plans are out there. And the bottleneck is really the uh, creation of fissionable material. And the more of that is around, the more potential for it to be diverted and then utilized in a weapon.
So I would add
Okay.
to that bad news and worse news, actually. um, the, the United Nations has allowed countries to have nuclear power. It's part of the UN Charter now of the body of law that internationally nuclear can be used for peaceful purposes. So that's one barrier that we're going to have to confront. Um, you mentioned the breeder reactors. We don't even have to wait for breeders. These small modular nuclear reactors that are being proposed to be sprinkled around like fairy dust, they're allowing the enrichment of the fuel to go just below what is considered internationally considered usable for nuclear weapons. It's a 19.5% enrichment as opposed to the 3 to 5% for regular reactors. And the threshold is 20% where you have to start worrying about the stuff being manufactured into nuclear weapons. So you could have hundreds of these small modulars all over the place, which have the potential because they're using what's called HALEU, high assay, low enriched uranium, which is just below that threshold, and it wouldn't take a lot more to push it over to get it into the weapons category.
Timon, do you want to respond to this
Well,
question?
Well, just in terms of, can there be no abolition of nuclear war without abolition of nuclear power? I mean, I agree completely with everybody speaking that, these both are intricately linked, and you wouldn't have nuclear power without the incentive and the financial incentive of having nuclear weapons, and vice versa. But I don't think we should get too hung up on how, we've got to get rid of both of these things. And, it's not that we can't be working on both of these fronts simultaneously, because we need to. And our coalition, we break ranks actually with the international campaign that I mentioned that got the Nobel Peace Prize and everything for the treaty, because, as you mentioned, the treaty it mirrors the other treaties that reference the inalienable rights of countries to have peaceful nuclear power, as they call it. And that phrase is still in all these treaties, including the ones that are no longer functioning. and so, our parent organization, ICANN, doesn't want to touch it because of that consensus. But our coalition in the U.S. is totally opposed to nuclear power as well as nuclear weapons. We see that they're linked. We have lots of groups in our coalition who are working on nuclear power campaigns. So we've got to get rid of both of them for sure. We just got to keep at it.
And let me add.
I would add just one note, which might be helpful, which is that there has been an uptake in progress in fusion power, which is related to nuclear power as we know it now, but produces far less contaminants and cannot be used to generate weapons-grade material. And people talking about expanding nuclear power as a bridge to sustainable energy, that could be a massive wrong turn. If fusion development races ahead, that would be a far preferable alternative to these dangerous and potentially disastrous nuke plants.
I think it's important to ask, what are the so-called justifications for more commercial nuclear power? And they're the specious ones that are all over the place now. Oh, the data centers, AI, we need it for that. Climate change, nuclear power will work on the climate change. It's all nonsense when you get to the numbers. One of our 50, 60-year-old colleagues, Amory Lovins of the Rocky Mountain Institute, had a great quote. He says, arithmetic is not an opinion. And when you crunch the numbers, you see what absolute bullshit it is that we're going to use nuclear power to reduce the climate threat. It's nonsense. It takes too long to build reactors and license them. And then you have their own set of problems. In terms of the data centers, we don't even know how much electricity these data centers need. So it is really a sophisticated circular game amongst the power people of self-justification to get more of these things in. Now, I want to drop a number on you to the whole audience here. When we were testifying 2 years ago to keep our moratorium, we pointed out that all of the nuclear power plants in Illinois, in the United States, there are 94 operating reactors. They give us about 98 gigawatts worth of power. A gigawatt is 1,000 megawatts. So you can figure a large nuclear plant is about 1,000 megawatts, 1 gigawatt. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, at that very time that I was testifying, said there are 2,000 gigawatts of power waiting to be hooked up to the grid, about 80% of which is renewable energy and storage. Now, you tell me we need more nuclear reactors when we have almost 45 times more renewable energy waiting to be connected to the grid. Technology's already invented, no radioactive waste, no nuclear proliferation. It's just a matter of the bureaucrats getting off their butt and getting these things hooked into the transmission grid, which is also falling apart, and that's a whole other issue. But we bring up this idea of the numbers don't add up. Sorry. There are better ways of getting electrons.
I I want to put two questions on the table from our question and answer section because I would just like the three of you, to respond to whichever of these questions makes the most sense. I'm going to start with Timon, just to hear his voice more. So the first question, oh, and there's another one that just came through, but I'm going to ask these. This one was specific to David Kraft, but I'm sure Tim and you could also respond. It says, "How do you address issues such as nuclear use in medicine? Can such limitations to, say, nuclear medicine, can humans resist transitioning from this helpful use to the dangerous use?" And then the other, oh, I see. Okay. The other question is about many people will point out that it's been 80 years of nuclear weapons and somehow we have not used them to attack each other. Well, I guess that's since 1945. That's a big exception, but how do we deal with the complacency regarding that, to saying that I guess we've deterred nuclear weapons use because we've only used, but the only country to have used it was the United States. And then there's a comment, two more comments on the mini reactors, which I'll come back to after you address these two questions. Medical use and the complacency around, oh, well, it's been 80 years since the last attack with a nuclear weapon.
Well, I'll just take the last one first. I mean, you're familiar with the story of someone jumping out of a 80-story building, and he's on the 40th floor, and they say, "Well, it's going fine so far." I mean, you
No,
can't,
not.
I mean, everybody that has pointed out the dangers of nuclear weapons point out that, we've been living on luck. That's all it is luck. And the luck's going to wear out. We've had so many close calls and accidents. I mean, High Point, was talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but I mean, there have been 12 times in history since 1945 when the world has come that close to nuclear war. We all know about the Cuban Missile Crisis, but there are these other examples, and there's been literally thousands of accidents involving nuclear weapons, including dropping nuclear weapons on North Carolina and into the sea and so on. They didn't go off, luckily, but like I said, it's been luck. And we just can't use luck as a strategy for survival of the human species. I mean, it's just crazy. So that's my response to that. I don't really have anything to say about nuclear medicine. Maybe David can answer that one.
Just, yeah, rather quickly. There are specialized reactors that are out there. Some of them are in Canada, as a matter of fact, which actually specialize in producing radionuclides for medicine. So you don't need these enormous power reactors of 1,200 megawatts, and you don't need a bazillion small modular nuclear reactors. We already have some reactors which can get us the radioisotopes needed for nuclear medicine. But that doesn't mean we need this enormous infrastructure of uranium mining and milling and processing, and then all the radioactive waste at the other end of the spectrum. It's overkill. And I love the story, Tim, and I use that one very often too when I talk. I link it to the Sears Tower here in Chicago, but anyway.
Just to reinforce Timon's point, the people closest to these events in positions of high responsibility have directly testified that they were extremely close to nuclear war. There's a recent documentary about Robert McNamara where he directly stated that he was involved in situations that were just minutes away from nuclear war. So this public numbness to the risk is almost as dangerous as the risk itself, because people are confusing accidental peace with the absence of the danger, and that's sleepwalking into a terrible future.
Hi, from this point on, can you highlight the speaker? I don't have the host. Oh, I could, couldn't I?
Yep.
You did make me a host. All right. Um, then we have uh, two questions on on the mini reactors and the nuclear reactors. One is from Barry Bender in New Jersey, Green Party of New Jersey. Um, and he asks, they're proposing four mini reactors on the grounds of the Oyster Creek Nuclear Generating Station, the oldest plant in New Jersey, the oldest plant in the U.S. The spent fuel rods going back to 1969 are stored there. If the U.S. is attacked via its current foreign policy, what would be the result if the spent fuel storage is bombed? And then the second question on nuclear reactors has to do with where those 2,000 gigawatts are that you're talking about that are not being put on the grid. And I will do okay, David, you're
Yeah.
on speaker view, so
Yeah. Oh,
I
okay.
have to, but I have to figure out, unless Heig, you can put the others on speaker view. I'm not,
That's good.
okay. All right.
Uh, First of all, a correction. I am not a doctor. And very often I have to also tell people I'm not a sir. I was never knighted. So Dave is fine. Um,
Okay.
okay. So let's see. Well, as far as the 2000 gigawatts, where are they? They are in various stages of development, everything from things that are almost shovel ready to things that are just paper proposals and everything in between. And also, it has to be understood, even though there are 2000 gigawatts, doesn't mean that all 2000 would be finally put into action. Financing goes bad, stock market goes down. There are a lot of reasons. But even if you took 10% of that, I mean, you still have more that you could get online that would be usable immediately compared to what we already have with nuclear. So it's a whole chain of events that have to be gone through in terms of regulation through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and then the various what we call transmission operating regions of the country. There are four of those that actually run the wires, and do the hookups. So it's a spectrum. It's not like go to Family Dollar and plug it in or anything like that. The first question, again, refresh me, was the four
For the
mini
spent
reactors.
fuel rods at the
Yeah.
four mini reactors.
Okay. Currently, the current reactors store the high-level radioactive waste from the very beginning of their operation on site. There is no repository anywhere in the country. So everything Oyster Creek ever produced is sitting somewhere on that site in one of two methods. It's either in what they call a spent fuel pool, which is a very deep glorified swimming pool, about 40 feet deep, has very special water in it with chemicals that absorb neutrons. And the very, very hot and radioactive fuel that no longer is good for producing electricity, when it's taken out, gets put in that pool for anywhere from 5 to 7 years just to cool down. Once it's cooled down, though, and they need more space in the swimming pool, they've opted for a second version called dry casks, which are outside of the building. They're very tall, cylindrical objects, very thick concrete walls, and they are air cooled, not water cooled. So it's a convection current thing that keeps them cool. So that's what you have to understand is where the high level radioactive waste is currently on every reactor, not just Oyster Creek. Now, that utility is also saying, let's add some small modular reactors to the site. They're proposing that for the Palisades reactor in Michigan and elsewhere as well. We don't know what the configuration of the radioactive waste for those small reactors is going to be until we know which design of small modular reactors is picked. And even when we know the design, we're only going to get theoretical propositions as to what configuration that waste will be. So it might not even be in a configuration that is amenable to a spent fuel pool or a dry cask or whatever. Now, the final piece to that was, what if we go to a war and they start lobbing nuclear bombs into those facilities? I would say if we're at that stage, it's a toss-up what you worry about. You know? It certainly won't make things better to have nuclear facilities, but you don't need a nuclear bomb to threaten the radioactive waste holding facilities at the sites. We found that out at Fukushima. The tidal wave knocked out the power. The spent fuel pools that were there were 5 stories above ground. And when they lost the cooling pumps to keep that water going and circulating and replenished, the heat from the spent fuel started boiling off the cooling water. So that had nothing to do with a nuclear weapon, and we almost lost Tokyo. So that shows you some of the vulnerabilities of nuclear power plants as they currently exist and as they are proposed to exist.
Okay. Um, are you all, did I get the speaker view? I'm not finding, I don't know how to do it, Haig. Um, I know we have David on speaker view, but for others who speak, I'm not sure if we're seeing speaker view. Um, but I don't know, and I apologize for that. Oh, there is one more question and a follow-up to one that's already been asked, but the new question is, what about the use of nuclear power for spaceships like Cassini?
Okay. That also is a very specialized reactor. It uses a variant of plutonium as its fuel. And we have used this, as you point out, in a number of our space probes already. Uh, yes, there is definitely a risk on launch that if something goes wrong and the space probe is destroyed, that plutonium will be distributed. In the case of Cassini, as I said, it's a variant of plutonium that decays, and when it decays, it gives off heat, but it does it at a very slow rate compared to some of the isotopes that you'll find in commercial nuclear power plants, which would give off their heat much more readily. So the plutonium-238, which they have in the space probes, I think it's 238, um, again, it's a slower decaying, longer lasting isotope. And you do run the risk of any radioactive substance that you put in a space probe. What goes up could come down.
Okay, and then I want to just follow up from the first or second question, and then I think if everybody can um, closing remarks, can add some closing remarks. We're close to closing time here, but that question about um, about the medical use of radioactive material. Um, is, the questioner, Patricia, was asking, she was referring to the propensity of some people to use existing small medical type reactors as bases for designing big ones. And she was wondering about that.
I'm not sure that I don't know enough about that to really respond. Although I
Okay.
will say um, there are over 70 design proposals in the United States and over 120 design proposals internationally for the so-called small modular nuclear reactors. There are at least a half dozen large scale reactor designs out there. And then there's a whole body called advanced reactors, some of which are the breeders that Haig was referring to earlier, and other designs. So there are plenty of other designs out there where I don't think we really have to worry about the medical reactors as serving as a template.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to throw this question at Timon because it's about nuclear weapons and atomic bombs, and also it will give you a chance to um, add some closing remarks here. And then we'll go to Haig, and then we'll go to David. Um, there's a follow-up to the question about complacency, Tim, and the United States government is the most significant culprit in this existential threat to humanity. It started with the U.S. as the only one to use atomic bombs. Da, da, da. I suggest we should focus our criticism on our government and industry. Um,
I couldn't agree more. Yes.
Mm.
And that's why we are focusing on the U.S. I mean, um, as I tried to demonstrate in my presentation, I mean, it's the companies. I mean, the government, you know, unfortunately, we have very little say. And I mean, this is a Green Party meeting, so you all know this. You know, the politicians in Washington don't listen to us. They're paid by the companies, including the nuclear weapons companies and the nuclear power companies, you know, and the fossil fuel companies and everybody else. I mean, it's the corporations and the billionaires who run them and invest in them that run this country. And so, you know, it's very, very hard to get any progress with trying to get the government to change. But we do have ways of putting pressure on these companies, is what I was trying to say. And that is why that is where we have some leverage. And it's been working. I mean, you may not feel like the fossil fuel divestment movement has done enough, but I mean, you know, that's had a huge impact on the fossil fuel industry and on the whole national conversation about fossil fuels. And we can do the same thing with nuclear weapons. These companies are vulnerable. They're not, you know, they need public opinion behind them. They need to feel like the people that work there need to feel like they're you know, doing their patriotic duty and not doing something evil. The companies need good standing with the public in order to have their stock market price stay high. And you know, there's all these factors that make them vulnerable, and they're vulnerable to countries outside the U.S. as well, as I was trying to point out. But we've got to take the initiative here in the U.S. To put pressure on these companies, and you can do it right now on your phone. You know, go to Facebook page of, you know, I mean, I put the list up of the companies, but you know who they are, you know, Honeywell, Lockheed Martin, you know, General Dynamics and all these, you know, there's not that many. There's only about 20 companies. And you go to one of them and say, you know, why are you doing this? Why are you threatening humanity? Put it on their Facebook page. Write them a letter. Go to their office. I mean, they have offices all around the country. And if you can get, you know, your faith community or your school or something, some institution that you're connected with, pension fund, to pass a resolution or to divest or anything, these are our tools that we have, and we've got to use them before it's too late. I mean, you know, Haig and Madelyn, you know, have made it clear how dangerous this is, and you know, we've got to address this problem before we're all done for.
Yeah, that's an important point. Very much so. We have to do it while we're here. Um, and go ahead, Haig. Did you want to add anything?
Well,
Closing remarks.
I'm inclined to play the trailer for a recent
Oh, yes.
documentary, uh, Daniel Ellsberg's commentary on this
Okay.
crisis that the world is facing. So I think that'll be my final contribution.
Final
I'll
con
share my screen and play that
okay.
now.
By the way, all it's about a minute and a half, so
I've long said, to my last breath, I will be doing what I can to postpone and avert the risk of nuclear war.
In 1971, U.S. nuclear war planner Daniel Ellsberg released the Pentagon Papers, revealing secrets of the war in Vietnam. But Ellsberg had other secrets in his safe, nuclear secrets.
Seconds to go. And
No language really does justice to this, but absurd is one word. Cataclysmic, catastrophic, evil. A readiness and a preparation and a rehearsal of causing nuclear winter and destroying most large life on Earth. That is insane. And you have to call it a kind of ordinary insanity because it's so widely shared. Can humanity survive the nuclear era? We don't know. I choose to act as if we have a chance.
The late, great Daniel Ellsberg, who made the world such a better place through all of his activism, his research, and more. Um, Thank you, Haig. It's a good place to end, but I didn't give David his chance to make final comments. We also have a comment here that Oyster Creek is the same design as Fukushima, just so people, Oyster Creek in New Jersey, just so everybody knows, because not everybody can read those questions. David, do you want to
Just very quickly,
make a quick?
I thank you again for having us give these presentations. And as I said, I thought in some cases it might be controversial. And I'm not here to make anyone who might be in favor of nuclear a bad guy in any way. Our job for 45 years has been to cut through naivete in some cases or ignorance. I don't know how much of what I presented tonight was known to your audience, but that's our job is to do that so that we're making sound decisions. It's like Plato said, you can forgive a child who's afraid of the dark. The real tragedy of life is when the adults are afraid of the light. And that's
Mm,
kind of our mission is to get that word out there. I guess the final thing I would end with, though, is I put it in the chat. There's a man named Stanislav Petrov, and I don't know how many of you know Stanislav. He was a former Russian major in the Missile Corps who saved the world. In fact, there is a documentary called The Man Who Saved the World with his name because he stopped the Soviet Union from launching what he perceived as a missile strike. And he, of course, was not very well rewarded for it, but he did save the world. Um, he said, and it's in the documentary, the best way to get rid of your enemies is to make them your friend.
mm.
And maybe that's what our job is. So thank you for listening.
No, thank you all. Thanks to the audience. There's no link to Stanislav Petrov,
No,
Barbara. It's just his name. Um, so thank you all for coming. I think we'll have this recording. This recording will be available so that everyone can share it out. To me, this was a very sobering evening on this 81st anniversary of Hiroshima and August 9th, don't forget Nagasaki. It brought me back, it brought us all back, but I think it also brought us to the present and the current challenges that we face. And GPACs, we really appreciate Timon and David Kraft and Haig and this whole webinar. Thank you so much and good night to everyone. Haig, is this where we are, or do you want to
Yes,
add?
I'm going to stop the recording now and
Okay,
say good night to all.
good night.
Thanks, everybody.